Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley and I am the Senior Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like you to welcome to this workshop, Designing and Using Assessment Tools, which forms part of the Training Accreditation Council's education program. This webinar provides practical and specific information on the design and the development of assessment tools to gather evidence that can be used to make judgments of competence. I would now like to introduce our facilitator for today, Russell Docking. Russell has been with the Training Accreditation Council for a number of years and is very versed in all things assessment. And without further ado, I'll just turn the video on and we can listen to Russell.
Thank you very, very much, Mel. And thank you, Mel, for setting this all up and making it all work for us today. Without Mel and the team at TAC, these education programs would not work. And I'm just the person who acts today to share with you these ideas. But what this is, of course, is part of TAC's education program. And this is part of what you might call a triptych or a trio, not too sure the proper term to use, of workshops on assessment. We'll do a brief recap on the previous workshop because this is workshop number 2. And we will then, I'll then refer you to the fact that the third workshop, which looks at assessment, judgment making or decision making and assessment validation and topics of that kind, if you almost could call it post-assessment activities, which will be on the 12th of May. I'll remind you of that a bit later on, but you do need to see this as part of a 3-part program. Just to share with you, I'm an auditor, as Mel has said, with the Training Accreditation Council, and I've had a particular interest in assessment and the specification of standards for some time. And so what I can share with you today is the current thinking about assessment. So the objective of today is to bring you up to date with how we're thinking about competency-based assessment today. And we'll share with you some things which are mandated by standards and other things which will be what you could call good ideas about assessment. And I'll need to make sure that during the session that I make it clear to you what is mandated in the standards, standards for RTOs, and what is advice, really to suggest to you strategies by which you can meet and demonstrate that you've met those standards. The references and resources are listed in the pre-reading, and I hope you've had a chance to look at the pre-reading. But the ones that we particularly will be focusing on today, of course, are the standards for RTOs, and in particular clause 1.8, which looks at assessment, including recognition of prior learning. TAC has prepared a user's guide, substantially thicker than the standards, because in relation to each standard, the user's guide talks about the sort of reasons why the standard is there, what the significance or importance, if you like, of the particular clause or set of clauses that it's reviewing, and then talks about strategies that you might follow. Again, it's advice, not mandated. The standard is mandated, but the advice is just that, on how you might achieve and demonstrate the requirement. And it also talks about the sorts of things that auditors will be looking at when it comes to making a judgment as to whether or not you are complying with the standard. TAC has also, through its education program, developed a number of fact sheets, and just to share those with you, they are listed. They all carry this banner on them, and there's one on assessment, and very much what we'll be talking about today is addressed in this assessment fact sheet. So you'll find that there's a consistency between what I'm sharing with you and what is in the fact sheet. So if there are particular issues you want to follow up, you may well find in the fact sheet that there's information that will help you. But of course, you'll see at the end of the presentation, you'll see that there's also an email address for the Training and Accreditation Council, and you can also send questions by email to effectively to Mel. And to have a look at the issues or particular issues that you might want to pick up on. There's also a fact sheet on assessment validation, and although that's primarily the topic for next time, May the 12th, if I can nag a little, it's nonetheless something you need to keep in mind, because when you're developing assessment tools, you need to keep in mind that at some point or other you're going to need to be able to validate those tools. Part of that validation is in the design process, but there's also post-assessment validation, which looks at the validity of delivery and use of the tools and the judgments that you make with the tools. And although, as I say, that's the topic for next time, you do need to have it in the back of your mind when you are developing the tools in the first place. There's also a fact sheet on the recognition of prior learning, and one of the critical things that we need to remember is that when we talk about assessment, we are talking about recognition of prior learning as well. And indeed, understanding the 1.8 of the standards for RTOs, you are required to make sure that your recognition of prior learning processes comply with that standard, including the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And related to it in a sense, because recognition of prior learning is recognition of learning that's happened in the past. So if you like, it's distance from the present in time. There's also a fact sheet on distance and online training and assessment, which is really talking about processes of assessment and training delivery where people are distanced in space, so to speak, or geographically distant. So you'll find that those fact sheets will provide you with information which is internally consistent in the sense that one relates to the other and they cross-reference to each other and are consistent with what we're sharing with you today. The outline for today is that we'll start with a recap of the first workshop outcomes. And much of that is in the pre-reading, so we won't spend a lot of time on that, but there are a number of particular points I want to emphasize because they have significance in our next part of the process. Our next part of the process will be looking at assessment of knowledge and assessment of skills. And we need to understand that they are functionally different within the context of competency, and that the assessment processes we use for knowledge and for skills are different, and we need to draw that out. And that then takes us on to ask, well, what would you need to show or declare in an assessment tool? And within the pre-reading, we have a couple of examples in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. These are really just sort of illustrative of the kind of information that you might have in assessment tool, as components of an assessment tool. And then that all comes together under the general heading of designing assessment tools, where we'll look at the sort of mapping process where we relate the tools that we're developing back to the unit of competency, because that's where the validity, the fundamental validity of the tools that we're developing is demonstrated. And there we are drifting a bit from the standards, because the standards declare that there must be a validity within the context of the design and ultimately the use of the tools, but it doesn't say that has to be done through mapping. We are suggesting to you that mapping is a really good way of doing it. So we'll share with you that process because, for two reasons really. One is because it helps you to make sure that what you're doing in designing your assessment tools is going to comply with the standards, but also because in session 3, we're going to show that you can use that mapping, the same mapping, for decision making and ultimately validation of the assessment tools. So that comes back under the general headings of the final session. So there again will be a sort of flow through from this session to the next session in that regard. Then we'll just deal with 3 specific issues as we close the workshop. One is clustered assessment. Another is reasonable adjustment, and the final one will be recognition of prior learning. So that gives you a feeling about where we're going, and hopefully you'll feel that the way this workshop works for you will work out to meet your needs. But please, as Mel has said, if you have questions to ask, please use the chat box. It's on your right-hand side of your screen, where I think it probably says "Say Something." Where it says "Say Something," you can type in a question, press send. Mel will receive it. I'll actually see it on the screen here. So from time to time, if my eyes wander across to there, I'll be looking to see if there are questions coming through, and we'll make sure that, or try to make sure that all your questions are answered. There will be during the session probably 2 breaks, which come fairly naturally because there are 2 activities, and those activities we will hesitate for maybe 10 or 15 minutes whilst you do those activities, and it's also an opportunity for you to take a break, an opportunity for us to take a break as well, we'll probably find that they happen more or less on the hour. But it's a bit difficult to predict precisely how quickly we'll be going through our session today. For the moment, we sort of have an expectation that we'll finish up at midday Western Standard Time, but it certainly won't be later than that. It might be just a little earlier. We'll see how we go. But please feel free as we go to ask questions, and I'll certainly, during those breaks while you're working on the activities, I'll be having a look at questions that have accumulated, and I'll make sure that we address those when we return after each break. So let's look at a recap of last session. And in the last session, which looked at the development of assessment systems, we dealt with a number of fundamentals, and it's important that I just draw your attention to those fundamentals and pick out a few of the key ideas, because they do have a bearing on where we're going today. So if you look at your pre-reading, on page 2 of your pre-reading, it provides a definition of a unit of competency, or at least a definition of competency, from the standards for RTOs. So this is found in the glossary of the standards for RTOs. And it describes competency as the consistent application of knowledge and skill to the standard of performance required in the workplace. It embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. The reason I want to draw your attention to that definition is because it's full of rich information about what assessment must look for. So assessment must look for consistency. We're not just interested in a person being able to demonstrate a quality as a one-shot demonstration. We can't judge consistency from that. So we need to build our assessment tools so that we can observe consistency. It says it involves application of knowledge and skills. So we are not just interested in recitation of knowledge and skills. We want the person to be able to perform, apply that knowledge and skills. So that really becomes important that we see that the assessment processes need to involve application, particularly when it comes to skills. Then it says that of knowledge and skill. So it straight away tells us that there are 2 components in a unit of competency which we must assess. There's a knowledge component and a skill component. And so we're going to look at the assessment of knowledge and assessments of skills fairly shortly. But this is stressing the point that these are not one and the same thing. These are quite different qualities within the concept of competency. And then it says to the workplace standard, which means our assessments must be reflective of workplaces. So when we ask questions in a knowledge test, those questions need to relate to the world of work, not just the sort of, dare I use the word, academic world, but the world where knowledge is actually used. And of course, when it comes to skills, skills aren't meaningful just on their own. They are meaningful because they contribute to effective and productive performance in a workplace. So our assessment of skills need to be reflective of workplaces. Either we carry out the assessment in a workplace, or we carry out the assessment in a simulation of a workplace. But we must never forget the workplace context that is going to be part of our assessment tools. And to do that, we have to draw upon our industry knowledge. Each of you, as an assessor, needs to have vocational competence, which means you can do the thing you teach. But you must also have current industry skills, which means you understand how the things that you can do actually connect to other competencies to ultimately produce productive and meaningful outcomes in the workplace. So you can see that the definition is talking a great deal about how we assess. And finally, it talks about transfer and apply to new situations, which basically means that an assessment needs to convince us that the person is not just locked into one understanding of the knowledge or one application of the skill, but can actually transfer that knowledge and skill to other environments. And that has a lot to say about our assessments as well. Our assessments should not be just a replication or a recitation of what we taught them in class. We want to know, can they take that learning and apply it to a new situation? Can they transfer that learning? Because ultimately, the ultimate challenge, of course, and the ultimate requirement of VET is that when we graduate a student, we are saying this person is ready for a future of work. In the higher education sector, when we graduate a person, we say they have completed a body of learning, which is backward looking. It looks to what they've done and says, congratulations, you've done that. Whereas in VET, we say, you've learned all this stuff, congratulations, you are about to do something else, which is go into the world of work. So we in VET talk about outcomes in terms of, with a future orientation. And therefore, it's really important, because we don't know what the future will bring, that the person can transfer the learning to new contexts. So you can see within that simple definition, there are all those key words: consistent application, knowledge, skill, workplace, and transfer. All of those have something to say about how we assess knowledge and skills. And that's something that you really need to focus on as we go. Then if we look at clause 1.8, which is our first line on our recap, we can see that where it talks about assessment, and this is the only clause that specifically talks about assessment, although as we discovered last time, almost every clause in Standard 1 talks about assessment in one way or another, but this specifically talks about it. The key thing here is that it says the RTO implements an assessment system that ensures that assessment, including the recognition of prior learning, so meets certain standards. First of all, that it complies with the training package requirements, and secondly, that assessment is conducted in a way which meets the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. But the key thing I want to stress here is that it says including recognition of prior learning. So when we talk today about assessing skills and assessing knowledge, we're not talking just about that sort of end of training assessment. We're also talking about the assessment of through an RPL process. And it really is important that we see that RPL is not some sort of soft assessment process, but it is in fact the full-blown assessment gathering full-blown gathering of assessment evidence through which we make a solid and quality judgment of competency. Because at the end of the day, we're making precisely the same judgment. We might be using evidence in a different way, but we're making the same judgment. And it stresses that in clause 1.8, where it uses those terms, including recognition of prior learning. And then finally, I want to draw your attention again on page 3 to the unit of competency assessment requirements and assessment requirements. And so it talks there about, we should have mentioned application, but then it talks about prerequisite units, elements of competency, foundation skills, performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions. Some of those things in there are skills, and some of those things in there are knowledge. And we need to distinguish between those and plan our assessment processes, our evidence gathering processes to pick that up. Finally, on page 5, there is a discussion about the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And I just simply draw your attention to those. There's a description there. There's also a description of these in the standards, but we've sort of fleshed it out a bit more with a bit more detail. And again, we need to have these principles and rules in the back of our mind, particularly today, the rules of evidence, so that our assessment evidence tools are valid. That is, they truthfully reflect the requirements of the unit of competency. our assessment tools must provide us with sufficient evidence to be able to make a meaningful judgment of competency, and we'll touch on that again shortly. They need to be authentic, that is, they need to tell us about the qualities of the student who is enrolled, and so we need to watch out for things like plagiarism or masquerade or other forms of cheating where an individual tries to present information which is in fact not their own work. And current, which means that we are at any stage in assessment leading to the award of a certificate saying that at this time the person has these competencies. And that's of particular significance and a particular challenge when it comes to RPL, because there we often try to use evidence from the past to make a statement about the present, which will reflect on where they'll be in the future. And you can see that we're stretching things a bit in terms of currency, which is a rule of evidence which we must comply with when we're using evidence that is from the past. So that was on page 5. And finally on page 6, there's a reflection on the fact that there are a number of things we need to be conscious of when we are developing our assessment tools. One is, and you can see it on the screen there, is that we need to reflect current industry practice. And that is basically saying that our tools will change as industry practice changes. And that will happen because we keep ourselves in contact with industry, which is a requirement of clause 113B, where it talks about your current industry skills, and is achieved through engagement with industry, which is picked up under clause 16B, where your current industry skills are sustained through maintaining contacts with industry. So making sure that our tools continue to reflect current industry practice is really important. It does mean that from time to time we'll need to revise our assessment tools. We can't just write them and then forget about them and just keep them using them forever. We need to keep pace with what's happening within industry. We also need to make sure that our tools are reflective of the resources that we have as an RTO, but it sometimes means that we have to look for other resources that lie outside the RTO, such as in the community, such as workplaces and the like. And so we need to make sure that we are conscious of the boundaries that are set by the RTO resources and work effectively within them. But we have to keep in mind too that the unit of competency might make certain declarations which ultimately prohibit us from assessing. For example, if it says that it must be assessed in the workplace and we don't have access to a workplace, then we can't assess it. If we can't assess it, we can't teach it, and we have to think about whether or not that's on our scope. Or we have to invest in resources so that we can assess it. What I'm getting at here is that compromise is not part of our game. If we don't have the resources and we can't do it, then we have to trim our scope to reflect what we can do. And so we're not going to talk today about workarounds. We're going to talk today about what the standards require and how you can meet them, and what sort of resources you'll need to bring to play to achieve that. And the final thing is that on page 6 it talks about assessment tools responding to the needs of candidates. And we're going to pick up on that a little bit later when we talk about reasonable adjustment, very briefly at the end of our session. But what that basically illustrates for us is that there is an interaction between the assessment process and the candidate, and we need to ask ourselves the question, to what extent can we modify or adjust our assessment processes to reflect individual candidate needs, and to what extent are there limits or boundaries to what we can do? So we do need to be conscious of candidate characteristics, and within the standards, responding to candidate needs and characteristics is a requirement. But again, we have always got that overarching requirement that our assessments must be valid, and therefore we need to make sure that in making adjustments we don't in some way or other destroy the validity of the assessment process. Now, all of that is in the pre-reading, and I refer you back to the pre-reading, but if there are questions that you need to ask in relation to any of that pre-reading, please feel free to do so, either now or later on, but that does give you a feel of the sort of things that we covered last time, and that does mean that as we go into our topics for today, hopefully we're working off the same script. So let's look now at where we're going from here. I describe this as a guide for assessment tools, but fundamentally we are going to come back to this idea later on. But I just want you to have in the back of your mind that when we develop these assessment tools, every requirement of a unit of competency must be addressed. That says that the unit of competency represents a blueprint. Indeed, they are often printed in blue, but it's a blueprint of what is going to be in the training program and what was going to be in the assessment tools. I sometimes like to illustrate this by saying, well, a unit of competency is a kind of target, which is pinned in place by a set of requirements called elements. Each element is in turn defined in terms of what it does and how you know it's been achieved by its performance criteria. And that's the relationship between the element and the performance criteria is important, because we are basically saying that the element of competency defines the performance criteria, but the performance criteria are not of themselves matters of interest. It's the element that's a matter of interest, and we look for the element by looking for its performance criteria. These elements and performance criteria are encapsulated in a kind of box which includes knowledge evidence, and there are certain rules which need to be met, and they are performance evidence, and this constitutes the stuff that we are going to assess. All the requirements that are written into the unit of competency must be addressed, and so we need to make sure that when we look at the unit of competency, we are able to see what that says about the assessment process. It's also, of course, the target for training, and we've reflected on the fact that there are different students with different pathways, following different learning strategies and different learning trajectories, all moving towards the same target. And that is one of the characteristics of competency-based assessment, is that we have variable inputs to the process of training and of learning. But what we want is a consistent output, and the consistent output being the unit of competency. We might also have variations in the way we assess, but what we assess is going to be consistent. And I want to stress at this point that if all the requirements are being addressed, and if we're meeting the rules of evidence, and although different assessors assess in different ways, because they're addressing the same requirements, they are in fact valid, and they are being able to make the same kind of judgment. And that's one of the qualities of competency-based assessment, is that we do not talk about standardized assessment tools where everybody does the same thing in the same way. We talk about variable assessment tools that respond to the requirements of industry, that respond to the RTO resources, that respond to the needs of the learner, and yet there is consistency and in terms of the thing being assessed, that is the unit of competency. And that's one of the qualities that's really important, particularly if we recognise that we're dealing here with national standards, and those national standards will vary in their context and in their application across the country, yet not vary in their meaning. And the variation in application gives you as assessors and as trainers a certain degree of freedom to operate to respond to your local circumstances. But the fact that there's a unit of competency means that variation doesn't lead to invalidity, because you're all working towards the same goal, all heading, if you like, towards the same destination. So every requirement must be addressed, because we need to know that everybody is heading towards the same destination, making the same kind of judgment about the same competency and the same set of qualities. Then we need to make sure that in gathering evidence, that we gather enough evidence to be confident that the student didn't just fluke it, the learner didn't just replicate something that you demonstrated in class, but that in fact there was solid basis for you making the judgment. So we'll come back to sufficiency a bit later on, but you'll see that that's something we always have to keep in the back of our mind. Are we assessing enough? On the other hand, we need to be careful that we don't over-assess, and so we need to make sure that our assessments, if I can use the word, are well targeted. The third thing is that we must not fragment elements. Over here, I've indicated that the performance criteria are characteristics, or are the characteristics of each element. You can't just pull the performance criteria apart and treat them as separate entities, because if you do so, you lose the sense of the element. And it's the element of competency that is describing the person. And so what we need to do, and describing the competency of the person. So what we must be very careful that we avoid is breaking an element up and assessing bits of it in one activity and other bits of it in another activity. The image I like to use here, it's a bit like saying, well, I know I didn't put sugar in the cake, but don't worry, I'll put extra sugar in the pizza. That doesn't work. The cake is inedible, the pizza is inedible, because even though all the ingredients are there, you've actually fragmented and stirred them up. What we need to make sure is that we assess in a way which respects the integrity of each element of competency, which means when we measure an element of competency, we measure all of its performance criteria at the same time. If we don't see all the performance criteria, we haven't seen the element. So our tools must be designed so that all performance criteria in an element can be seen at the same time. We need to be very careful that we don't add extra requirements. And I do from time to time come across very diligent trainers and assessors who say, oh, you know, the unit's not really good enough. I've improved the unit. I've added extra stuff. I've made it a little tougher to separate the sheep from the goats. Mind you, I'm not too sure which is the better student, the sheep or the goat, but never mind. The thing about it is that we cannot do that. We must retain the integrity of the unit by only looking at assessing the qualities of the unit. Anything else we might be interested in that doesn't belong to the unit, well, we can ask about that if we want to. We can mark it as yes or no if we want to, but we must exclude that extra stuff from the judgment of competency. In other words, we must be very careful that we're not distracted by that extra stuff and that we don't imagine for some reason or other that extra stuff can be part of the judgment of competency. We have to be very careful that we don't put extra requirements in. That would be invalidating our assessment processes. And so any unrelated evidence that might happen to be sort of floating around, we have to look away from so that we don't get distracted by that unrelated evidence. Finally, we need to make sure that we gather the correct kind of evidence. And here we need to draw the sharp distinction between assessing knowledge and assessing skills, because knowledge and skills are actually quite different. They're intimately related. That is, the knowledge needs to be knowledge that supports the skills, and the skills will be things that utilize the knowledge, but the way we assess knowledge and skills are quite different. So what I want to look at now is those processes of gathering evidence of knowledge and gathering evidence of skills. And I'm going to put it to you in the simplest, but in actually the most complicated way I can. By that I mean it's fundamentally simple. So let's not muck about here and say fundamentally knowledge is asking the question, what do you know? And so if we want to ask a question of a person and say, what do you know? If you imagine yourself sitting with them across a coffee table and asking questions, you would ask a question, and from their answer, you would determine what they know. You wouldn't ask them to perform something, you just ask them a question. You fundamentally want to know what's in their head. What do they know? So it's going to be through question and answer. Some people think we should use tasks. If we use a task, a person can perform a task without knowing how it works. They can perform a task without the knowledge behind it. So that you can find a person who can play a musical instrument but can't read music. In other words, they can perform, but they don't have the knowledge in terms of, say, reading music and following a score, that would normally enable them to deal with variations. So, for example, if you then ask them to play a different piece of music and they can't read the music, unless they can just perform it without knowledge, then they will be stumped. They will not be able to transfer the skill from one context to another. But if they can read music, then they can play anything you put in front of them. And so you can see that knowledge and skill are different things. A person can be skilled and not be knowledgeable. And a person also can be knowledgeable and not be skilled. So you can know a lot about something, but not be able to do it. So we need to understand that these are not interchangeable, that knowledge assessment does not tell you a person has a skill, and skills assessment does not tell you that a person has knowledge. So we have to have two different methods of assessment. One assessment tool or one set of assessment tools will be related to knowledge, and another set of assessment tools will be related to the assessment of skills. That's not to say that you can't, in the process of carrying out an assessment of a skill, ask questions. Of course you can. But what you're doing when that happens is changing your mode of assessment. Although they're performing a skill, as soon as you start asking questions, then you have now moved to the question and answer mode. And what you are now doing is measuring knowledge. So I'm not saying that these assessments have to happen in different places and different days. What I am saying is that there are two different methods. One method, question and answer for knowledge, the other method, which is performance of tasks to demonstrate skills. So if we start thinking about knowledge and skills, and we're now going to focus briefly on knowledge, we need to ask ourselves the question, well, why is knowledge there? And indeed, you'll notice that if you look at the unit of competency, that knowledge is only mentioned in the second document, which is the assessment requirements. And indeed, for a short time, fortunately a very short time, it was thought that competent people didn't need knowledge. I'm not too sure how that idea arose. It was probably because in the higher education sector, the focus is on knowledge and skills are there just to support the development, enhancement and demonstration of knowledge. But in the vet sector, where our focus is on skills and knowledge is there to support the skill. So for a while, we thought knowledge was so unimportant that we wouldn't even bother mentioning it in a unit of competency. And it still to this day remains a poorly defined part of a unit of competency. So the knowledge evidence list in the assessment requirements is often poorly defined, poorly described. Skills are well defined. We have elements and performance criteria which define the skill rather beautifully and on the most part very well. We have performance evidence which enhances the evidence assessment of skills. And we even talk in the assessment conditions often about assessment happening in the workplace. And there we're really talking about skills. And then we have this sort of impoverished section called knowledge evidence, which is just a list of knowledge. And there's a bit of a problem there because people lose sight of what the knowledge is about. So what I want to share with you is a way of looking at knowledge, why it's there, what its function is, because that will help to shape the sort of questions you ask in your knowledge test. And I want to suggest first, and this is in fact directly taken from the unit of competency really, is that one of the first function of knowledge is to support the elements of competency. So that does mean that the knowledge you ask about needs to be in some way or other related to the elements and the performance criteria. So if you want to know what question to ask, look at the application of the competency and its elements and performance criteria and say to yourself, well, in terms of this topic of knowledge, what does a person need to know in order to be able to perform that element and those performance criteria? So that's the first, if you like, clue to interpreting a particular set of words or of a particular requirement in the knowledge section. Then you need to think, well, the knowledge is there to help a person understand how tasks work. Because at the end of the day, the task itself is usually unimportant until it becomes part of a kind of collective of tasks that lead to productive outcomes in the workplace. So understanding how tasks work is an important part of knowledge, and in that, what it's doing there is reinforcing a person's performance of the elements of competency, particularly when things go wrong. Because if a person understands how tasks work, then when things go wrong, they can cope with contingencies because they understand what's going on behind the task, behind the elements of performance criteria, and can adjust their behaviour and their strategies to lead to the same outcome. So they can only do that if they have knowledge lying behind the skill. Otherwise, they're just performing like an automaton and they will not be able to adjust what they're doing. So knowledge has that kind of function. So think about how when you ask your questions in terms of the knowledge section, can I ask questions that tell me that the person understands what's really going on in this task or this particular competency? And can I ask questions that will help me understand that this person can cope with contingencies? But we also need to ask ourselves the question, can this person transfer this competency to other contexts? And one of the beautiful things about knowledge is that you can take a person's mind to any industrial context, to any workplace, to any part of Australia through questions, through knowledge. With skills, you're kind of constrained to the workshop or the workplace where you happen to be. But with knowledge, you can traverse state boundaries, even during COVID. With knowledge, you can ask questions about different workplaces to the ones they've experienced, different state or territory requirements. You can, through knowledge, look for transfer of competency beyond the here and now, and that is really useful. And particularly when you're looking at a competency which might have evolved or changed over time, where equipment might change or evolve over time, keeping in mind that your graduates are going to go into workplaces that might be a bit out of date, you can, through knowledge, assess whether or not they can cope with strategies that are not current, not present right now. Or they might be going into high-tech industries and high-tech workplaces, in which case you can, through knowledge, find out if they are prepared for those. So you can see that you can take your current industry skills, your knowledge of the way industry works and the variations within industry, and reflect that in your teaching, but also reflect that in your assessment. Now you can see that knowledge is no longer just the sort of background noise to a competency. It is now crucial to a competency being able to cope with variations, to cope with changes in environments, to cope with changes over time. In other words, the knowledge is serving to provide the individual student with a general understanding of industry, and through your knowledge assessment you can establish whether or not they have that. So now we can see that knowledge is not, although it's just a kind of afterthought list in a unit of competency, is really a very critical part of those other qualities of competency, such as consistency and transfer, and of workplace relevance. And you need to build that into the way you assess. Unfortunately, that's not written down as a formal requirement, and as an auditor, all I can ask is, are you assessing each item of knowledge? But as an auditor, I would really like to see you not just asking a question for each item of knowledge, but using that knowledge and using those questions to ascertain that the student can transfer from one context to another, is aware of variations in terms of regions and states and so on, is aware of and can understand how things can go wrong and how they can overcome those problems. In other words, there's a richness in the knowledge which is needed, but I can only look for that in hope from the point of view of compliance. All you have to do is show that you've measured each bit of knowledge. When it comes to the knowledge assessment process, I'm going to suggest some things to you which you might find a little harsh. Indeed, the first one is is going to be annoying to a lot of people, and forgive me for this. But look, and I've been a bit rude here. I've said not multiple guess. You know, I mean not multiple choice. But the big problem with multiple choice questions is, firstly, they don't reflect what happens in industry. Very rarely in industry would a person be presented with multiple choice questions. They generally, there's a question, an open-ended question, to which they have to produce an answer, usually a short answer. So what will be required of them in industry is not to be able to answer multiple choice questions, but to be able to answer short questions, to provide short answers to those questions. And so we very much prefer, and again I want to stress it's not a matter of compliance, but it's advice, that if you are going to reflect the way knowledge is used in industry, then don't use multiple choice questions. And indeed, what a person is doing in the multiple choice questions is not only not reflecting what happens in industry, but what you are providing them with a set of choices. They actually only have to recognize the right answer. They don't have to generate the right answer. They just have to recognize the right answer. And so in real life, they're not offered choices. In real life, they have to generate the answer. So you can see that this is critically important. Now, given the fact that we are often now using things, doing things online, using Blackboard and the like, the temptation to use multiple choice questions is very strong. And I would argue strongly that we're giving way to the technology rather than understanding and following the needs of industry and the needs of the unit of competency if we do that. However, it's not a compliance issue. And we would have to say that if you've got multiple choice questions, you're compliant. But we would have to say too that that's not best practice. That's not indeed even good practice. Well, the next thing we need to do is to make sure that we get evidence from every item of knowledge. But we have a question from Wayne. When designing an assessment, should we include both performance criteria and performance evidence in the skills section of evidence assessment? Wayne, I'll get to that in a moment because we're going to be going to assessment of skills shortly. And I'll just try to make sure I keep your question in mind when we get to that, to make sure that it's there. But you'll see that I discuss that. We'll discuss that with you under the heading of skills assessment, which will be following the knowledge assessment. And Irene says sometimes there is a disconnect between knowledge evidence and the elements within the unit. Is this correct, or have I misinterpreted this? Look, I have to tell you, Irene, that sometimes there's a disconnect in the minds of the people writing the unit of competency. And you need to look for a connection between the knowledge evidence and the elements. You need to be able, but you then go on and say, I found this to be the case when mapping an assessment tool whereby I can't map the knowledge evidence to the performance criteria. Irene, please don't try to map the knowledge evidence to the performance criteria. The performance criteria are about performance, the knowledge questions are just about knowing. So what you need to look at is the general application of the unit of competency and the general application of the elements of competency, and ask yourself the question, how does the knowledge relate to that? But each item of knowledge will be mapped to itself, not to skills. We don't map them to skills. We basically say that the skills tell us about the context of the knowledge and the fact that the knowledge supports the skills, but they don't necessarily map one-to-one in the way that maybe you would like to do. Yes, I can understand that Asquith's not too keen on multi-guess either. I'm just responding to Nigel, I think the fact is that I think the message is getting through across the regulators generally. But as things stand, we have to say that multiple choice can be seen as a legitimate, even if not best practice. So I would continue to argue at this stage that the standards don't tell us that multiple choice is invalid. I just think it's weak as an indicator of knowledge in terms of this sort of functionality. You need to make sure that our questions are at the right AQF level. And this is partly born from looking at the application of the unit of competency, and again looking at the elements and performance criteria and saying how sophisticated is the unit of competency supposed to be. If the unit of competency has an AQF level assigned in the code, then that makes it fairly easy, because you can say, well, here, you know, at the certificate 2 unit, they just need to be able to recite the names of things. They don't have to demonstrate sophisticated knowledge. Or here in this diploma unit, they need to be able to utilize knowledge in a much more sophisticated way. And so I'll ask much more sophisticated questions. What you need to do is to make sure that your knowledge questions reflect the fundamental level of sophistication, which might be reflected in an AQF number, but make sure that our questions are not too sophisticated and not too simplistic. And that really is getting a feel for the sophistication of the unit and then matching your knowledge questions to that. One of the big problems that we have is that we ourselves are sophisticated, more sophisticated than the competency we teach. And therefore there's a danger that we will ask more sophisticated questions simply because they're questions we can know the answers to. And I'm not talking about dumbing it down, but we do need to pitch our knowledge questions to the level of sophistication of the unit, and not to our level of sophistication, but the level of sophistication of the unit. We need to make sure that the context and content of all the questions are relevant to the unit and reflect current industry practices. So we need to bring into play our current industry skills and embed our knowledge questions into the context which reflects that current industry knowledge that we have. And we need to make sure that we don't ask a bit of knowledge really because we're really interested in that bit, but it doesn't have anything to do with the unit. We need to keep to the script. The unit defines a boundary of interest, and any questions that might lie outside that boundary will be invalid. And we need to make sure that we stick to the script in terms of what the unit is asking for. And finally, and this is a bit weird, but we are interested in transfer. Not transfer beyond the unit of competency, but transfer of the unit of competency. So we need to be able to say, well, we can use the knowledge to ask questions about transfer over time. We can talk about old practices, or we can ask questions about new practices, and we can talk about and ask questions about the person's knowledge of processes beyond where they are now. And that helps us to know that there is within their knowledge base the ability and the preparedness to transfer the competency to another context. That if they walk into a job where things are done differently, they will not be shocked by that experience. They will be prepared for that experience because you taught them about the variations of application of this unit, and you've asked them questions about and have ascertained that they can cope with those sort of variations. So you can see that when we start thinking about knowledge, that it is generally speaking not too complicated, but there are a number of things we need to think about as we go. Wayne has asked another question. Wayne has said that in apply safe working rules and regulations to rail functions, this varies greatly between states. How can we deliver a competence to somebody in New South Wales when they can go to WA where it's totally different? It is not a good idea to cover all state systems in one go. And I would agree with you entirely, Wayne, but it's also wrong to suggest that there is only one way. So what you would do is you'd say, this is how we do it in New South Wales, but you need to be aware that it's done differently in South Australia and done differently in Western Australia and so on, because the person needs to know that there are differences. These are national qualifications, not New South Wales or WA qualifications. So you may not teach them the WA system and the WA standards, but you would alert them to the fact that there were differences. And you might point out the sort of differences there might be. You would not expect them to recall what the differences were, but you should expect them to recall that there are differences, so that when they move into Western Australia to get a job in the Western Australian rail system, having been trained in New South Wales, they are ready to be inducted into a slightly different system. The fundamental competencies of rail management will be the same, but the context within which they're working will be different for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are sort of local, some of them are sort of political, some of them are sort of geographic, some of them might be climatic. There'll be differences which are sometimes logical and sometimes not, but they need to be aware of those differences. Of course, we would expect that if they got a job in Western Australia, that the employer would induct them into the new environment, knowing that they've been trained in New South Wales and vice versa. But you don't want the students to be unaware of the fact that there are differences. And so you would make sure that that was in your knowledge of when you were delivering the unit of competency, that you were talking about and sharing with them the fact that there are differences between states. And that means, Wayne, that you, in terms of your current industry skills, need to make sure you know about what's happening in Western Australia and where there are any other variations. So where there are variations across Australia, in terms of the apply safe working rules, it's part of your requirement of having current industry skills is that you know about all those variations. You may not be able to recite them off by heart, but you need to know that they're there. You need to know the sort of variations that occur, because when it comes to safe working, you can't allow for a person trained in Western Australia to operate to Western Australian requirements in New South Wales and have an incident. So you can see that it really is important that there is this awareness, and that's knowledge. They won't be able to demonstrate the Western Australian standards in New South Wales because it just simply won't work in New South Wales environment, but they can have the knowledge of it. And you can see that how the knowledge enables them to get national recognition rather than just one state or another state. And that really is important. So there, I must say, is one of the requirements of, and it's particularly important if you're working in an RTO that is enterprise-based. I mean, if you're delivering training as part of, say, BHP, and forgive me, BHP, I'm not having a go at you, you cannot train the person just to be a BHP worker. You are training to national standard. And so you need to talk about other mining companies and other processes and procedures, even though they are of the competition, because you're delivering not a localized enterprise-based unit of competency, you're delivering a national unit of competency. And the best way you can do that is through knowledge. You may not be able to demonstrate it as a skill, but the best way of doing that would be through knowledge. Hopefully that, do you have another question? Anthony, you asked a question. Do we have to include LLM assessment in the UOC assessment? You have to ask yourself the question when you look at the knowledge, evidence, and indeed the unit of competency generally, Anthony, you need to ask yourself the question, what are the language, literacy, and numeracy requirements of the unit? And so if we're dealing with a Certificate 1 unit, it's not likely to have very significant language, literacy, and numeracy requirements. And therefore, we need to make sure our assessments don't have significant language, literacy, and numeracy requirements. We may well, in fact, find that at Certificate 1 level in our assessment tools, we don't do it through written tests, for example. We might do it through oral assessments for knowledge, and even there might be pictures or cartoons that we use to assess knowledge. We might use imagery to assess knowledge at Certificate 1 level. By the time we get to Certificate 3 level and Certificate 4 level, we would expect a certain level of literacy and numeracy because that would be implicit in the unit of competency itself. They might be writing reports, they might be reading plans, they might be reading instructions and protocols. So they'll be reading and writing as part of the unit of competency, and we would therefore expect our assessment tools to involve that level of reading and writing, and we wouldn't be embarrassed about that. Certainly when we get to advanced diploma level, a diploma and advanced diploma level, then we would expect language literacy and numeracy to be mediating almost everything they did. And therefore we would expect the assessment tools and the activities that they're performing to be very much literacy, numeracy based. But it really is important that we don't utilise language literacy and numeracy requirements in the assessment tool that exceed the natural level of the performance of the unit. And there again, our industry skills kick in. In the world of industry, does a student write an essay on providing customer service? No, they don't. What they do is they provide customer service as a skill, as a hands-on skill, and they would provide answers to questions, maybe from the customer or from the kitchen in the case of a restaurant. They would answer questions orally. They would not say, just a minute, I'll write you an essay. They would actually provide oral answers to oral questions, short answers to short questions. And so what you can see is that if you look at what happens in industry, if you look at what the unit is requiring, that will tell you the language literacy and numeracy requirement of your assessment tools. And you have to be very careful that you don't disenfranchise a student because you've chosen a method of assessment that exceeds both their own level and the level of the unit and the level of the requirements of industry itself. Keep going back to how is this unit used in industry, and keep going back to that not only in terms of the skills, which is pretty obvious, but also in terms of the knowledge. I mean, if a person's sitting in a restaurant, they don't offer multiple choice questions. Well, the menu is a kind of multiple choice question, isn't it? But fundamentally, they don't offer multiple choice questions. They ask a short question, you know, and you're expected as a waiter to be able, wait person to be able to provide a short answer rather than write an essay. So just keep in mind what happens in the workplace, and you'll get a very good feel for how it is that you're supposed to measure, how it is you're supposed to assess. So to illustrate that, we've got a little activity that we'd like you to consider, and this will be in your resources somewhere. There's a handout, activity 1, and there are 11 questions drafted, and on the left-hand side you'll find the knowledge evidence item, written with the same level of obscurity as they really are, and on the right-hand side you'll see a draft knowledge question, and each one of them in some way or other is flawed. So what I'd like you to do is to have a look and see if you can find the faults. So in this slide here, there we go. This is what you'll find in your materials. And so the first knowledge item is knowledge of food safety strategies in a commercial kitchen. And the question is that might be posed for this is, explain why food safety is important in the hospitality industry, 100 words. Now what I'm asking you to do is to say, what's wrong with that question as a measure of that knowledge evidence item? And there are 11 of them for you to look at. We're going to take a break now. It's about 10:05. I suggest that we take a 10-minute break and then for you to work on this. And so at around about 10:15, we should reconvene. And I must confess, quite obviously, I've gone through this myself and answered these questions myself. But if you can share with us your answers to these questions, not your critique of these questions, then that would help us share these ideas. So what's wrong with the questions that have been provided on the right-hand side of this chart as a way of assessing the knowledge on the left-hand side? Hopefully that's clear to you. Let's take that break and reconvene in 10 minutes. Welcome back, folks. I hope you've had a nice little chance to take a break, and probably in around about 3/4 of an hour we'll take yet another break, so that you're not too fatigued. I realise that sitting at a screen listening to a boring old bloke talking is not the most exciting way to spend the day, so I'll make sure that you get a break as we go a bit further on. But just have a look at these questions here. And the first one, knowledge of food safety strategies in a commercial kitchen. When it says explain why food safety is important in the hospitality industry, 100 words, first of all, it's not actually asking them to demonstrate a knowledge of food safety strategies. It's talking about food safety, but it's just saying why is it important, is not actually demonstrating a knowledge of food safety strategies. The other thing is that writing 100 words in a coherent way and an efficient way is essay writing. And so what we've got here, and probably I would say that this is a low-level unit in the sense it's probably a certificate 1 or 2 level unit question from a certificate 1 or 2 unit. You wouldn't expect the person necessarily to be highly articulate and to be able to construct a 100-word answer in a sophisticated sort of way. And so clearly what we've got here is that we're not actually measuring the knowledge evidence item, and we're asking the person to perform a skill, which is essay writing, which is not part of the level of sophistication of the unit of competency itself. When we come to the second question, knowledge of the use of PPE in warehouses, the problem we have here is that, for a start, we're only asking a person to recall an answer. And the second thing is that the answer to this question may vary according to the warehouse. So we are actually got, again, a double problem. One is that the answer that they may have worked in a warehouse where you only wear PPE when you're working in the loading area, in which case they'll give an answer which they believe to be correct, but it won't necessarily be correct because of the specific context in which they worked. So again, we're inviting a problem. The third one, the knowledge of the names of the bones of the foot, describe the typical damage to bones in the foot arising from the football incident, is very much higher in terms of AQF level than just simply naming the bones of the foot. Naming the bones of the foot will be AQF level 1 or 2. Describing typical damage would require them to talk about the bones of the foot and probably to name them, but it also will talk about a whole lot of other things, relationships of the bones to each other, the kinds of damage that's typically done in a football incident, the like, becomes much more sophisticated. So what we've got here is a terrific drift in AQF level, that the AQF level of the knowledge item is low, the AQF level of the question is very high. When we come to the fourth one, knowledge of risks that can be found in an automotive repair workshop. List the risks in your automotive workshop depends entirely on the automotive workshop. They could be working in one that's sort of in a rural environment where it's a little bit chaotic and haphazard, in which case the place will be loaded with risks. And in other circumstances, they might be working in the cool, clinical environment of in a sophisticated automotive workshop in which all the risks have been removed by careful design and planning, in which case what we are seeing there is that they don't reflect the kinds of knowledge that generally might be found in automotive repair workshop. It becomes just a list of what they can see around them. It's actually closer to a skill, because identifying the risks in an automotive workshop is a skill. Knowing what the risks might be is knowledge. Then if you get to number 5, it says knowledge of problem-solving techniques and knowledge of conflict resolution techniques. And then there's a question. The problem is if they get it wrong, they could get it wrong because they got the first bit wrong, or the second bit wrong, or both bits wrong. Make sure that if there are 2 different items of knowledge, that you have at least 2 different questions, so that you can discern where the problem is. Knowledge of chemicals used in hairdressing. List 6 chemicals used in hairdressing seems to be quite reasonable, but there's no indication of what level is required. Do they need to name all 6? Do all 6 have to be correct? Would 4 chemicals used in hairdressing be enough so they got 4 correct out of 6? As soon as you ask them multiple answers, like list 6, you need to say how many of those 6 need to be right. Do they all need to be right, or would you be happy with 3 out of the 6, or 4 out of the 6, or 5 out of the 6? to be right in order for you to be able to say, yes, they have a knowledge of chemicals, hairdressing. Number 7, knowledge of competency-based assessment. Write a short essay on the history of competency-based assessment. I'd love to do this one. 1,000 words. If you are quoting another source, you must use the APS referencing method. Well, there's a classic, I might say. First of all, knowledge of competency-based assessment is not the same thing as knowing the history of competency-based assessment. So we've missed the target. We're not actually assessing what's supposed to be measured. Secondly, we're asking them to write a 1,000-word essay. So we're really assessing their ability to write an essay rather than to demonstrate knowledge of competency-based assessment. And finally, if they are required to use the APS referencing method, what we're doing is insisting that they have a whole bunch of extra skills which relate to referencing, which takes most people about 6 months to learn and to be able to be consistent with it. So what we've done here is drifted enormously away from simply knowing what competency-based assessment is. And so you can see that although you as an assessor might think the question is a butte question, and I do think it's a butte question, it's the wrong question. It's not a question that I'm entitled to ask in relation to that item of knowledge. Then there's knowledge of different types of evidence, list different types of evidence. And this is just a repeat of the question. What I need to do is to set it into context in some way. Where could different types of evidence be used? How could different types of evidence be used? What are the benefits or strengths of different kinds of evidence? So knowledge of the rules of evidence take us closer to that. List the rules of evidence and provide a brief explanation for each. But as soon as we do get that into explanation, we are perhaps pushing the level of AQF level a bit, because knowledge of the rules of evidence could be just a recitation of them. There are 4 of them and you could list them, or which is the first part. But as soon as we ask for a brief explanation, maybe we're pushing the boundary. We'd need to look at the unit of competency to see what level of sophistication was expected. So if this came from a basic unit, then just listing the rules would be enough. If it came from a more advanced level unit, such as a diploma level unit, brief explanation and application of the rules would be appropriate. So we need to consider the question of whether or not we've hit the right AQF level. Number 10, knowledge of the rules of evidence. The rules of evidence are validity, authenticity, currency, sufficiency. Provide one example for each on how a person contributing assessment might meet these rules. Look, in actual fact, looks okay to me. I think that what we've got here now is not just listing the rules, but we're saying, well, how do these rules of evidence actually contribute to quality assessment? And finally, knowledge of the potential barriers in assessment relating to evidence gathering procedures and assessment processes. There's 3 barriers to evidence gathering procedures. It only deals with the barriers. It doesn't relate to other requirements. It doesn't, for example, relate to processes. It only relates to barriers. So it's only measuring part of that knowledge requirement. All I want to illustrate with this is that it's awfully easy to write bad knowledge questions. And part of the process of writing knowledge questions is to make sure that you go back and ask yourself the question, why have the people writing this unit put this knowledge evidence requirement in there? And it's difficult with this list because we don't have the whole unit, and therefore we can't really set the evidence question in context. But that's what you can do. You can look at the knowledge question that you've written, or a knowledge question that's been provided to you by someone else. Maybe you've purchased an assessment tool, and ask yourself the question, does this knowledge question address all the requirements of the knowledge item? Does this knowledge question, is it pitched at the right AQF level in terms of the sophistication of the unit? Does this knowledge question contribute to the application and use of the skills involved in this unit? Does this knowledge question reflect adequately evidence or provide evidence of transfer and the ability to transfer? Those are the sorts of questions you need to ask. So what I'm asking you to do when you write knowledge questions or when you purchase knowledge questions is to interrogate them. Ask yourself the question, is this knowledge question going to tell me what I really need to know? And do keep in mind that the sorts of questions you ask in knowledge actually shape the way students learn. If you ask in simplistic, trivial questions, the students will learn in a simplistic, trivial way. If you ask questions that reflect the quality of the competency and enhance its transfer and its consistency and so on, then the students will learn in a way which enhances and strengthens consistency. In other words, you get what you reap what you sow. If you use trivial questions, you'll get trivial learning and you'll get trivial performance, and you won't be really contributing through the knowledge the sort of way that knowledge can contribute to competence. Now, in your materials, you'll find that we have provided some sort of mock-ups of the sorts of things that you might find. There we go. This is in your pre-reading, I think Appendix 1. You will find on pages 8 and 9 of your pre-reading the sort of headings that you might have. We're not suggesting to you at all that all these headings have to be used. These are just illustrations to you of the kind of information you need to provide. And ask yourself the question, what does the candidate need to know in order to be able to respond to these questions properly? And what does the instructor or the administrator of the assessment tool need to know in order to administer the assessment tool properly? It's really down to you to decide what's going to work in your context with your student group at your RTO. Always though, and I might just throw this in as an auditor, be prepared for an auditor to ask challenging questions. Why did you assess it this way? How can you be sure that you've covered everything that you need to cover in these knowledge questions? So in other words, be prepared to answer those questions by asking those questions of yourself beforehand. That way you can refine and improve your knowledge assessment processes and you won't get any nasty shocks. Do always keep in mind though that particularly when it comes to knowledge, your auditor will probably know much less than you do, vastly less than you do about the subject matter, in which case you may need to explain to the auditor how what you're assessing does conform to national standards and to industry requirements and to the requirements of the unit of competency. What I'm getting at here is that it's not so much the assessment tool itself, but how you justify and explain the assessment tool that's important. And in going through that process for yourself, you will enhance your skills in assessing knowledge. Let's now look at the assessment of skills. Here we are moving to a different world altogether. In the case of knowledge, we're asking a question and listening to the answer. The person's performance is simply answering questions, which might be done in a classroom, it might be done in a workplace, it might be done during the assessment of a skill. You can ask questions anytime you like. And it might be done in writing, particularly with high AQF level students, and it might be done orally if students have language literacy and numeracy issues, particularly language and literacy issues, then the process might be done orally. And Karen has said, would an open book assessment depend on the AQF level? And Karen, my answer to that is my standard answer, which is, what happens in industry? If in industry the person has to conjure the knowledge out of thin air, then open book is not acceptable. But if in industry the person can refer to a manual or to a guide or to a checklist or whatever, then open book is fine. So keep going back, Karen, to what industry is expecting, because what you are doing is emulating the use of knowledge in industry. Now, in the case of the, say, using of an elevating work platform, then what you'll find is quite often printed on the side of the sort of cab that you climb into are safety instructions. It's all written down there for you, in which case open book might be legitimate because in a sense the operation itself is open book. But if they're dealing with something that they might have to deal with spontaneously, without saying, hang on a tick, let me go and look at the reference book, but have to be able to respond with a bit of knowledge straight away, then closed book would be necessary, because you want to know, can they conjure up that knowledge without reference to a resource? So keeping in mind, again, what happens in the world of work. If in the world of work they can access checklists or guides or books, then open book is good. If they can't, then open book is not appropriate. And also keep in mind too that when it comes to open book assessments, what you're often assessing is the person's ability to find a bit of information rather than their possession of the knowledge itself. So you are again measuring something slightly different from the possession of the knowledge. So it always go back to industry, and indeed we have to do that when it comes to measuring skills. So fundamentally, when it comes to a skill, and the skill would include foundation skills, elements and their performance criteria, and maybe some aspects of, or certainly aspects of performance evidence. When we're in that territory of the unit of competency, then we are going to use task performance. Keep in mind that every single element of, every single unit of competency comes from a workplace. So the reason we have these units of competency is because they are used in the performance of tasks. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them there. There's no point in a unit of competency that does not relate to one or more tasks. They all come from the vocational units of competency. The natural habitat, if you like, of a unit of competency is the workplace. And the natural use of a unit of competency is in the performance of tasks. So it's not just an artifact of assessment, it's the reality of vocational competence that tasks is where they come from, and it's within tasks that they are used. So what you need to do is draw upon your industry expertise, back to your industry, current industry skills and knowledge, and say to yourself, can I imagine some tasks which use this competency? That imagination of tasks will then be ameliorated by the fact that you'll say, well, which of these tasks can I replicate on campus? Or do I have to see those tasks out in the workplace? More and more units of competency are saying these tasks need to be seen in the workplace. And there's a logic to that as well, because it means that there's a kind of naturalistic environment for the application of the competency rather than artificial environment. And I'll come back to that notion in a couple of slides when we talk about simulation. So fundamentally, you go to your industry skills, you imagine tasks, and you say which of these tasks will reveal the skill. When you pick a task, you may find that you need more than one task to cover all of the elements. That's all right. But every time you're measuring an element in a task, that task must measure all of the performance criteria of that task, of that element. So that you must be careful that you don't say, I'm measuring these performance criteria in this task and the rest of the performance criteria in another task. What you've done is what I talked about before in terms of moving the sugar from the cake to the pizza. What you have done is broken the element apart, and you have not seen the element at all. So each time you use a task, it must measure whole elements, although the task may not measure whole unit. And that's why I say in the second line here, successful performance of two or more tasks with user skill shows the candidate has the underlying task. I beg your pardon. I've said the bottom line here, beg your pardon. A number of tasks might be needed to observe all the elements and all the performance evidence. Not the performance evidence there is distinct from performance criteria. The performance evidence part is another part of the unit of competency. So you might need a combination of tasks to see all the elements. Each time you're seeing an element, you're seeing all its performance criteria and all the performance evidence. Try as much as you can, though, to simplify the assessment process by trying to imagine tasks that cover the whole unit, if you can. Successful performance in two or more tasks with user skill show the candidate has the underlying skill. And I'd like to illustrate that, if I may, with another diagram. I think, can you see me over here? Yes, you can. And that basically is that if we think of a person's development of competency, at some point or other, they will go above a threshold where And I'm illustrating this as a two-dimensional picture, which is a little bit simplistic and a little bit naive, but that's the only way I can do it on a two-dimensional whiteboard. If we carry out an assessment at this point, because they're above the threshold, we say that they're successful. What we cannot say, though, is that they're consistent in their performance. And I don't know how we move there. I'll just go back. Okay, can we go back? What? Oh, you have. Thank you. Thanks, Mel. So that we cannot say that it's consistent because we've only seen it once. We can't say something is consistent when we've only seen it once. And nor can we say that there's been transfer because we've only seen it within one context. Nor can we know that their behaviour will be retained. It's quite possible that after that assessment, because we've just done that one-shot assessment, performance might decline below threshold. And so we have a problem with one assessment. And although a lot of units of competency say they can be assessed at least once, then it's not saying it should only be assessed once, it's saying at least once. Well, we would argue that twice is a best practice. Because if you do a second assessment, and now that becomes A1 and that becomes A2, then what we are saying to the student, you need to retain this performance level. In other words, you need to retain competency above threshold. You mustn't just forget it as soon as you've been assessed with it. So that encourages retention. And of course, keep in mind that the way you assess will affect the way they learn. If they know they're going to be assessed twice, they'll learn to keep things and retain it. But furthermore, what you'll be able to see is that if you vary the conditions of these two assessments, they're both maybe still observations of a task, but the task might change, or the materials used in the task might change, or the outcomes or the product of the task might change. Under those circumstances, you've changed the two assessments, or the two assessments are different from each other. What you've then seen is transfer. And what you've seen is that they now must have acquired the underlying skill so that they can then transfer it to other contexts. So you can see that the second assessment gives you an indication of consistency. Yes, they've done it twice. It gives you an indication of retention. Yes, they've sustained the level of performance over a period of time. And thirdly, it tells you that they've got transfer. So we would argue that best practice is two assessments. Sometimes, of course, some packages actually require more than two. Sometimes they require dozens of assessments. But when it says at least once, you should not see that as an invitation to assess once. Good practice. And if you think about the definition of a unit of competency, strangely enough, if you're assessing once, you're probably not compliant with the definition of a unit, because the definition of a unit required consistency. One assessment won't show you that. Transfer, one assessment won't show you that. It doesn't actually say, but it's implied retention. After all, there's no point in a unit of competency which a person acquires and then just forgets. So we can see that there are real merits in two sources of evidence. We don't need that for knowledge, but we do need that for skills, because that's where transfer and so on kick in terms of having the underlying skill. So that you need to use your industry skills to identify tasks, more than one really ideally, that enable you to conceive all the performance criteria for each element of competency. And you might need a number of tasks, as we've said before. Now, if we can go to the next slide. There we go. The second thing, what's happening is my mouse has got a mind of its own here. Its tail is dragging it off the table. Make sure the tasks you set are at the right AQF level. Fabs says, so does this mean you can't split assessments to cover different separate PCs in an element? Yes, you cannot split assessments to cover different or separate PCs. What you do as soon as you do that is you destroy the element. You break the element apart. The element is defined by the concurrent presence of its performance criteria. So an element is not the separate sum of the performance criteria. It is all those performance criteria happening at the same time. And that means you cannot split an element up into a separate performance criteria. It's the sort of another imagery I might say is that, if I might say, what's the performance criteria of a table? Well, it has a flat surface. That flat surface is horizontal, and it has legs. And I could say, well, okay, if I look at this wall, it's a flat surface. If I look at the floor, it's horizontal. And if I look at me, I've got legs. Does the wall, the floor, and me make a table? No, we don't. Yet all the performance criteria are here. Why isn't there a table? It's because it has to happen on one entity. This table has a flat surface, and the same table has a horizontal surface, and the same table has legs. So this is a table because it complies with the performance criteria. And you can see that the performance criteria defines a table. If it had a back, it would no longer be a table, it would now be a couch. So adding extra performance criteria changes what it is. So you mustn't add extra performance criteria. And leaving performance criteria out changes what it is. If you leave out the legs, it's not a table, it's a floor. If you leave out various performance criteria, it ceases to be the thing you're trying to measure. So keep in mind that as soon as you start breaking up an element into separate performance criteria, you can destroy the very thing that you're trying to assess. So always keep in mind that you must not dismember an element of competency and treat the performance criteria as if they were separate entities. And notice too that the performance criteria can have multiple meanings. The table has legs, I have legs, this whiteboard has legs, chairs have legs. All those legs differ in terms of their function. If they're holding up a seat, they're the legs of a chair. If they're holding up me, they're legs of a person. If they're holding up this, then they're legs of a whiteboard. The word legs has no meaning unless you associate it with other performance criteria and with its element, if you like. So the performance criteria are just indicators. They are not of themselves important. They are indicators of what is important, which is the element of competency. So you are never measuring the performance criteria. You are always measuring an element. And the performance criteria are just there for you to know, yes, I've seen the element, or no, I haven't. And they're there to help you understand what the task needs to do. So to make sure that the task that you've created or that you're utilizing actually calls upon the demonstration of the performance criteria for the elements within that task. So you can see that the performance criteria are different. Weirdly, we used to write them differently. We used to write elements which so that you're clearly talking about the person able to do something. And then the performance criteria are written in a different way because they were not describing the person, but describing the element. We've drifted away from that now, and all our performance criteria look a bit like we're talking about the person, but in truth, we're talking about the element, not the person. And then when we're talking about the element, we're now talking about the person. And when we talk about the competency, we are talking about the person. So you can see that there was in the old days, if I can refer to them in that way, a kind of clue in the way in which performance criteria are written to remind you that they are not of themselves enough to know about. You have to look for the element and use the performance criteria to know when you've seen it. So you need to make sure that you need that. Thanks for your question. I've forgotten who asked that question now, but thank you for that question. Make sure the tasks you set are at the AQL level and do not introduce too much complexity that might overshadow the skill. So when you start thinking about a task, try to keep the task, if you like, focused on the skill. So don't pick a task that has so many different dimensions and so many different facets that the task itself becomes a monster that is very difficult to see the skill within. A little variation on that, of course, though, is that if you can think of a task that measures more than one unit at a time, what you've got is clustering. And that's really cool if you can do it, because, but you need to make sure that there's a balance here. As soon as you introduce clustering, you increase the complexity. And so whilst a person might be able to perform an element on its own, they may find it difficult to perform the element in a cluster. I beg your pardon, a unit on its own. They might find it difficult to perform the unit in a cluster. So you need to make sure that you don't, in your eagerness to measure as much as possible in one task, make the task itself so complex that the person now can no longer demonstrate that they really do indeed have the competency. And that will have a lot to do with the AQF level. You can expect at low AQF levels the tasks to be very simple, even simplistic, and quite focused on the unit. As you get up into higher levels, certificate for diploma and the like, you would expect the task to become more complex and multifaceted, because these are people operating at a more sophisticated level of thinking and operation. And then you need to develop an observer checklist. So fundamentally, when it comes to the task, we're not just going to focus on the final product. We want to know how they arrived at the final product. So we need to observe them performing the task. And we need to provide a checklist for an observer who's watching that. It may be you, but it might be a third party, and we'll come to that in a moment, who's doing the observation. And what we need to be able to say is, well, what aspects of the performance relate to an aspect of the unit? There will be aspects of the task that don't relate to the unit, and you've just got to be able to ignore them. You need to make sure that they don't get in the way of your judgment about the competency. In other words, we need to understand that it is not the task that we're measuring. We are using the task to measure the competency. Never lose sight that what we're looking for here is evidence of competence, not evidence of the task. So don't let the task distract you from the competency. Yes, embedded in a task, but that's not the purpose. The purpose of the task is to tell you whether the person has or has not got the competency. So it really is important that you build a checklist to focus the observer on the qualities of competence found through the task, rather than focusing on the task itself. The task is just the vehicle, it's just a carrier. It's just a catalyst, if you like, for performance of the competency. It is not the thing of interest. It is the competency that is the thing of interest. And that does tell us that we need to also look within the workplace for competence, because these tasks, these competencies come from workplaces. They come from tasks within workplaces. They are qualities that the person takes into a workplace to be able to perform a task. And so the connection between the competency and the workplace is crucial. We need to build that in, which means, again, we go back to your current industry skills, that what you need to understand is how this competency actually works in a workplace. So that when you walk into a workplace and you see people performing tasks, you are actually seeing them demonstrate competencies. That's what's going on in there. Every day they go home and they take all their competencies with them. The next morning they come back to work and all the competencies come back in again, and they utilize the resources and materials and structures and protocols of the workplace to produce useful products. But what the person brings are their competencies. So it's the way in which their competencies as individuals interact with each other and interact with the materials and interact with the protocols and interact with the workplace generally that leads to the consequences of a productive outcome. And that's the kind of perception that you need to build. So when you walk into a workplace, yes, you'll see tasks, but then say to yourself, how are those tasks working through competencies of the people doing those tasks? So you can find assessment, and indeed the natural place for assessment is the workplace. And indeed, a lot of units of competency are now saying you need to use the workplace as the first port of call for assessment. But they will also say, in circumstances where the workplace doesn't provide an opportunity to see the competency, then you can use a simulated workplace. And here I want to stress that a simulation has significant requirements. It has to be a simulation of a workplace. So when you're doing a simulation on campus or whatever, the actual task skills involved must be performed. The actual competency, the elements and the performance evidence all has to be there. If it's not there, then it is not a good simulation. If it's a simulation, it needs to involve the kind of complexity of our workplace, so that they might have to prioritise tasks and the application of their competencies. So there will be task management skills. These, of course, you might recognise as the dimensions of competency. They also need to, because in real workplaces things go wrong, and how they cope with things going wrong is a good indication of transfer and of that they've really got the underlying skill. So in your simulation, you need to make sure that it's not so beautifully contrived that nothing goes wrong. You want to make sure that things do go wrong. Don't put a sign on the door saying, "Quiet, please, assessment in progress." Put a sign on the door saying, "Come in and make a nuisance of yourself, assessment in progress." Because in real life, in the real workplace, all of that sort of stuff goes on. And in real workplaces, the job role environment is one of quiet chaos. So if you are doing a simulation of a workplace, because that's what's required by the unit of competency, then there needs to be in the simulation the rough and tumble and grubbiness of real workplaces. I don't mean grubbiness in terms of dirt. I mean it's just not so clinically contrived as to be too artificial. If you do use a simulation that hasn't got these qualities, then when they go into a real workplace, they'll experience shock. And indeed, they won't be ready for it. And you'll have made a wrong prediction in terms of their ability to perform the competency. It will not be workplace related. That does mean that there are certain things which really won't work. And quite often when it comes to simulation, people use things like role plays, scenarios, projects, case studies. They almost never meet these requirements. Now, a project could meet the requirements of a simulation if in the workplace they were doing a project. But if it's a project that they're doing on the care and support of aged care residents, that is not what happens in aged care facilities. A person does not do a project. A case study, they're just reading about something. They're not getting the visceral feeling of the interaction and exchange of really what would happen. So you would need to perhaps go to a sophisticated role play kind of environment where there were people playing the role of, say, a person with suffering from of some personal issues, and you were providing counselling. It would not something done through a case study, because you're not getting that sense of being in the workplace. It would need to be done through a role play of a sophisticated kind, where the roles were being performed by people who knew how to do that. And indeed, in some training environments, actual professional actors are employed to perform roles to bring on that visceral experience and to demonstrate that the person can handle it. Peter is talking about, at my college, the leadership and management business students have set up a cafe as a business. This demonstrates skills and knowledge required. And this is the sort of thing, you'll see that in various colleges and TAFEs and so on, where they've set up actual hairdressing salons, or they've set up actual workshops which simulate the real environment where there are real class customers, happy and angry, and customers and impatient customers, where there are real costs involved and real economies to have to meet, and so on. In other words, but you can see that those simulations involve a lot of planning and a lot of investment. That means that if you're going to use a simulation, it's not an easy, soft option such as a scenario or a case study, which you might do online, and you'll get no idea as to whether the person can actually perform the skill. They might watch a video of someone else performing the skill. That isn't the same thing as them performing the skill, even if they do a critique of it. Rosalind is asking, would virtual reality be able to be used? Well, the virtual reality can sometimes work. You can get the visceral feeling. I've worn a pair of glasses, goggles or whatever you call them, and had that sense of being on the edge of a precipice through virtual reality. But I'm always conscious of the fact that I am in virtual reality, and therefore it does bring on some of the visceral side of things, but maybe not enough to know that I have the skill. So could I learn rock climbing through virtual reality? Probably not, because it doesn't involve the muscle strength and so on of actually clambering up or down a wall. I might get some of the vertigo experiences, but not necessarily the physical experience. So you can see that virtual reality will depend on whether or not the virtual reality can safely reflect these qualities of task skills, task management skills, contingency, and so on. And the real task might not be something you can emulate through virtual reality. Kerry talks about, we have a printing business set up on campus where students take order, quotes, invoice, and then design, use programs and print. And that's another example, Kerry, of where your simulation has been made to be like the real thing. But make sure that you've got some angry customers who are not happy with the quality of printing and bring it back saying, I want this redone, where the person has to deal with the natural kind of environment. So ask yourself, in terms of, you're an expert in printing, Kerry, so basically you would think, what can happen in a real workplace? Can that happen in our business? If it's not happening in our business, how can I make it happen? Can I go in and be the angry customer who's not happy with the speed of work or the quality of work or the accuracy of the work or whatever? And so that you make sure that this printing business you've set up is not so artificial that the person doesn't, is going to be shocked when they walk into the real world of printing. And you might even have to thanks, Kerry. You actually doing these sorts of things. That's good. Some planned and some unplanned. That's good. It's exactly like real life. But you might also have to, literally in your case, throw a spanner in the works where things go wrong, where there's a blackout and the computers don't work or something of that kind. What is the workaround involved? Because in real life, that might be the sort of thing with which they have to deal. The final thing I want to touch on here in terms of skills is who is the observer. I've indicated in an earlier slide that you need to build a checklist to observe, but what you're not observing is the task. What are you observing is the competency. Keep that always in mind. So if you're using a third-party observer, you need to guide them very carefully to make sure that they aren't focusing on the skills, but are focusing on the competency, which means that they need to have a checklist, and that checklist may need to be contextualized for their understanding, because in a particular enterprise or in a particular workplace, they might use different language or different terminology or different equipment or whatever. So you would need to make sure that you contextualize the observation tool. Perhaps I should change that word to observation tool. Need to be contextualized so that they understand exactly what it is that they're looking for. They will not necessarily understand what the unit's about, but by your careful contextualization and your careful listing of what they need to look for, you will have made sure that they focus on those aspects of competency about which you are interested. They will need to have industry skills because they will need to know what these things mean, and they will not necessarily have TAE qualifications or TAE skills. So your checklist will need to guide them through an observation process which keeps them focused on what really matters. They need to provide a written narrative of what they observe. Now, by this I'm saying they cannot make a judgment. Indeed, they're not allowed to make a judgment. Only a qualified assessor is allowed to make a judgment. So they should be reporting to you what they have seen. And then you use that evidence to make a judgment because you are the qualified assessor. So strictly speaking, we talk about third-party observers. Please don't talk about third-party assessors because they cannot be assessors as you are, because they don't meet all the requirements of Standard 113 ABC and 114 and 115 and 116, which are the requirements of an assessor. So they are not assessors, they are observers. They can provide evidence of, they can provide narrative of evidence, which you can then use to make your assessment judgments. And they must be subject to routine monitoring and validation. Indeed, they must subject themselves to your standards as an RTO. They are acting on your part as an observer. So they must accept the fact that they may well be monitored by you as part of, and validated by you as part of your post-use validation, standards 1.9 through to 1.11, got to get a life. Or they could even be subject to audit by an auditor, not on their own. An auditor's just not going to rock up and say, I need to see what you're doing in this. It would be because you are being audited, but the auditor can legitimately say, where does your evidence come from? You might say, oh, it comes from the workplace. They do workplace activities, in which case the auditor can say, okay, let's go out and look at a workplace and see how this is done. They might look at your workplace resources and how you guide and support and prepare your observers, how you monitor your observers, what sort of feedback you get from the observers, because they are now part of your assessment system and therefore are part of what can be audited. So they need to know that. They mustn't get any shocks. And indeed, sometimes, we have a problem. I know, for example, in my case, if I'm going on to a mining site, I have to wear the PPE and I might have to produce my safety card and so on in order to be able to walk on the site. I know that I can't walk into an abattoir and look at performance in the killing room, for which I'm very grateful, because I don't have my Q fever injection. So there are some things I know I can't audit because I'm not allowed access to that environment. But most of the time, auditors might legitimately say, if this is a source of evidence, we need to see how that source of evidence is managed. Okay, I want to paint a little scenario for you in this next activity, and this will also lead to a little break, that second break, which I promised at around about now. It's amazing, we seem to be almost on time. And what I want you to think about here is various strategies. And I want you to imagine a situation where an alternative strategy for assessment has been required because we need to get some evidence of performance for skills. So what we've got here is a whole lot of strategies, 8 of them, for assessing competency and particularly assessing skills. What I want you to do is just to make a little bit of a comment on it. This is covered in activity 2. And it says here, you are conducting practical assessments where you assess a candidate in the workplace. An unavoidable situation has occurred and you are no longer able to access the workplace to assess the student's skills. And then I provide 8 strategies which you might use instead of observing the student perform. What I'd like you to do is just to pick 3 of them. Don't pick the bottom 3 or the top 3. Pick a scatter of 3. Give some thought to whether or not this would work as a assessment gathering strategy. And on the second side of activity 2, you've got a number of questions. For the first strategy, second strategy, and third strategy, I'm asking you, is this look like a valid way of assessing skills? When would this strategy work well? When could there be challenges about this strategy? And what would you do to overcome the challenges that the strategy creates? So what I'd like to do is to suggest that we convene again at 20 past 11, which is in 10 minutes from, beg your pardon, 15 minutes from now. I'm giving you a bit more time because I want you to reflect on this and also just to take a little bit of a break from the workshop. And then after this, we will move on into some of the final planning sort of processes and those 3 areas of interest. So let's take a break and reconvene at 20 past 11. Welcome back, everybody. We are running 4 seconds fast, which is fine. And that does mean we'll finish 4 seconds earlier today. with activity 2, I've suggested a number of strategies for assessment, and it's not uncommon as an auditor for me to see an RTO or a lecturer or an assessor with an RTO saying, well, I know the unit says that this should be assessed in the workplace, but we found it very difficult to get to the workplace, so this is what we've done. And what I wanted to do is just to illustrate with these 8 examples that they're not always strategies that are legitimate for us to adopt. Indeed, if we look at the first one, ask the student to describe how they would undertake the task, it's an assessment of knowledge. It's not an assessment of skill. So that is clearly not a legitimate, valid way of doing it. And there's nothing I can do to make this work. I can't dig deeper with my questions. They're still not performing the task. They're just talking about how to perform the task. And indeed, there are a lot of tasks that I, as an auditor, have observed and could describe to you, which sounds like I can do it. But then if you actually ask me to pick up the tools and do it, you'd suddenly discover that I actually couldn't do it at all. I could talk about it. You can see already I can talk about almost anything, but I could talk about it, but not actually be able to do it. And so it's really important to see that this would not be as an adequate alternative. I will say one little thing though. Sometimes a performance criterion, or even sometimes an element, happens very rarely in a real workplace, or it might be very, very expensive to simulate, or it might be quite dangerous to simulate, in which case we do allow the notion of you asking a what-if question. So a person could be dealing with a particular sort of electrical fault, and you might say, what would you do differently if it was raining at the time and what you're working in a wet environment? Now, for me to simulate that, it might be dangerous, or it might be expensive because it makes a mess, or it might be that it doesn't happen very often, in which case the what-if question would be legitimate. But it is not legitimate to do that across the board. It would only be because that particular task was very rare, very expensive, or very hazardous, in which case a what-if question would be acceptable. So that's just a little aside to this. The second one, seek a reference from an employer for whom the student has worked on this kind of task. The trouble is that the employer might not have actually seen the student do it. The learner may not have been seen doing it. The employer might not have a skill. We recently, or not recently, but some time ago, got an employer to comment on an apprentice chef, only to discover that the employer was an accountant who owned the restaurant and employed the apprentice chef, was an accountant, and therefore could not comment meaningfully about this apprentice's chefing skills. We asked the wrong person. We needed to ask the chef in the restaurant, not the employer. They may not understand the standard, even if they are from that field, even if they do have expertise. They may not understand the standard, and therefore might provide you with all sorts of information in a reference which is irrelevant to the unit and may not tell you much about what is relevant to the unit. Or they might simply provide you with untrue information. There might be reasons why they tell you something that is false. So number 2 is terribly risky and probably, and most of the time, would not be useful. Number 3, review past evidence of a student's performance on similar tasks on campus might be okay, but the word similar would suggest that, in fact, we might have some aspects of the competency in that similar task, but it may not be covering the aspects in the kind of detail we would need. So we would need to do a very close analysis of those similar tasks to decide whether or not they were sufficiently equivalent. And indeed, what you can see is quite often, if you look at the training package in training.gov, it enables you to do comparisons between current units and superseded units. And if you look at the superseded units, you can actually get through training.gov, you can get a comparison which says the elements are different in this way, the foundation skills are different in that way, the knowledge evidence is different in this way. And that way you'd be able to decide whether those other tasks were sufficiently similar for you to be able to make a judgment in relation to the competency upon which you were focusing. The fourth one is to set up a scenario where the student reads about an issue and describes how they would resolve it. I'm afraid that's a bit like number one. There's not the visceral involvement. It's too artificial. It wouldn't meet the dimensions of competency, and it's very much like knowledge. Number five is set up a group role play activity where other students are the actors and observe the student's performance. Well, that would be fine if they're really good actors. But if they're not really good actors, there again will not be that sort of visceral engagement. And the other problem is that you may not know whether or not the student upon whom you were focusing actually performed the skill, or maybe it was someone else. Group activities, when it comes to measuring skills, can be very tricky. Number 6, number 7, and number 8, though, I reckon are okay. Because I've said in number 6, set up a simulations where the other students are clients, but now you make sure the simulation meets the dimensions of competency. And if it truly does meet the dimensions of competency, then it'll be a good simulation. Or you could use professional actors. And indeed, there are some RTOs that go to the expense, and there's no question that it's expensive. But particularly if you're dealing with high-risk units, then professional actors might be necessary rather than using other students as clients, because other students may well indeed not be terribly good at performing the role. Or set up a practice workplace, which is the sort of thing that Kerry was talking about before when he talked about his printing. Kerry, if he or she, forgive me, where Kerry was talking about setting up a printing business on campus. So fundamentally, you can see that some of these will work, particularly 6, 7, and 8, but 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are not legitimate alternatives. And so you cannot, and doing a lot of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 4 and 5 does not make it good. A lot of bad evidence does not equal good evidence. So please avoid going down those sort of pathways. In your materials, in Appendix 2 of your pre-reading, there are some suggestions to the sort of things that you might have as information for students and information for, or instructions for the candidate and instructions for the assessor in a checklist for performance assessment. I'll leave you to look at that, but it's just there as to give you some ideas about the sort of headings. I've embedded it a little bit in a contribute to assessment unit of competency, just so that there is text under the elements and performance criteria, but there's no more meaning to it than just as a way of illustrating what a performance assessment tool might have as components. What I wanted now to do is to move on to mapping. Thank you very much, Mel. Mapping unit requirements and assessment tools. You've seen this slide before, but now we're going to talk about how you make sure that your tools, that is your knowledge tools and your performance tools used for assessing skills, ultimately really do address the requirements. And note those requirements. First of all, every requirement must be addressed. Sufficient evidence must be collected. Elements must not be fragmented, which goes back to a question asked by a previous person. No extra requirements can be included, no unrelated evidence can be gathered, and correct type of evidence is gathered. What we suggest, and I do want to stress to you, it is a suggestion, this is not mandated by TAC or any other entity, but we do suggest that you consider using a mapping, and a lot of RTOs now do use a mapping of this kind. And most of the time it's called an assessment plan. The words "and record" have been added because in the next session on the 12th of May, there I go again, onward marching with the next session, we are going to show how this mapping can also be used as a record. So for the moment, ignore the final two columns. The outcome column and the comment column relates to the record role. But in terms of planning, we're just dealing with the first columns. The left-hand column is a unit requirement, and so you first of all need to make sure that this column of information for the unit is in fact correct. This is for contribute to assessment. I'm not asking you now to go to that unit, but I will share with you how this table can be used. So the first thing we would need to do is to make sure that every unit requirement was listed. and that none had been added in. Then we look at PA1, which is Performance Assessment 1, Performance Assessment 2, Performance Assessment 3, and Knowledge Assessment. And we ask, are we using the right methods to carry out assessment, or are we using the wrong methods? Have we split an element up and fragmented it, or have we not? And straight away you can see that if you look at element 1, I only observe the first two performance criteria in the first assessment, and I observe the second two performance criteria, set of performance criteria in the second assessment. So I haven't actually, PA1 plus PA2 does not equal an assessment of element 1. PA3, I do measure element 1 because you can see all four performance criteria. So PA1 and PA2 for element 1 are useless. They're not actually telling me anything about element 1 that I can use, because all the performance criteria have been split. And that's an illustration of where things can go wrong. If you look down under knowledge evidence, you'll see that questions 7, 11, and 13 relate to performance criteria 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. That's ridiculous, because they are performance requirements. They're not knowledge requirements. So I should not be mapping my knowledge assessment to my performance criteria. That gives me, these are things to be seen, not to be known about as knowledge. So I should have in PA2 and PA3, I should be looking for performance of these performance criteria to tell me that element 2 has been achieved, and so forth. Now, if you look at the next slide, actually the next slide shows you the knowledge component. I might just touch on that before we go. Here is the knowledge evidence listed, and you can see that, for example, rules of evidence, no question is set against it. So there's a gap there, something not being measured. It's not measured anywhere, so I have straight away a validity problem. If you now look at the next slide, you can see here is my critique. And you can see that there are all sorts of problems with this, even down to the fact that the wrong code has been put up at the very top there. You can see I've handwritten wrong code. Further down, you'll see that, in fact, that there are errors in the list of unit requirements. Performance criterion 2.4 is missing. That have actually added in a foundation skill when there weren't any foundation skills. Neat, accurate, and prompt reporting. Wow, I think that's important, so I'll pop it in. No, you can't. You can't pop it in. There are no foundation skills, so you cannot put things in there. You can see where I've split elements, for example, where I put ovals and question marks against element 1, because I've split the elements, and I haven't at either stage actually assessed all of them. You can see over there for Q7, Q11, Q13, not the performance of a skill. They're questions, and they can't be used. You can't use questions to assess performance. You have to use performance to assess performance. And that sounds a bit sort of naggy, but there you go. And observation 8 and observation 9 don't get a mention anywhere. So why am I observing observation 8 and observation 9 if they don't actually, there's a danger that they'll distract me from what I need to see. And you can also hear that, for example, different types of evidence are being measured by performance. They should be measured by knowledge, not by performance. And so fundamentally what we have here is a whole bunch of problems with this particular mapping. And what the mapping does is tell you whether or not what you're doing is consistent. You'll notice that PA1 and PA2 are both forklift assessments. But if I'm truly going to get a measure of a person's ability to operate within different contexts, I need to make sure the contexts change. So also you can see CV and employer reports are used for performance assessment 3, but the trouble is that the CV and employer reports are not going to really tell me, even though this is an RPL process in that particular assessment, does not meet the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. So fundamentally, what we've got in that mapping is an illustration of something that's gone way off track. Now, you might say, oh, well, he's just created a straw man here, but I have to tell you that this is what I see as an auditor. I have been looking at hundreds and hundreds of mappings, and again, I don't see all of these in one mapping. Please don't think that. But what I do see is these kinds of problems cropping up. And I've come across RTOs that have said, oh yes, we saw that problem, and you know, very proud of themselves because they found the problem. I say, well, what have you done to fix it? Oh, haven't done anything to fix it. And you say, well, fundamentally, you should be using this mapping tool to revise and validate and improve your assessment processes. And in that way, what you do is build ultimately a set of assessment tools that truly reflect what you require. And that might be something like the next slide. Now, it's looking terribly dull, but then why should it look complicated? Why shouldn't it look clean and clear-cut? So under PA1 and PA2 and PA3, I think of a task that will enable me to assess all of the performance criteria, in this case of all of the elements. My observations now enable me to, you'll notice I've blanked out the foundation skills because there are none. If we look at performance evidence, I've carefully gone back and found observations that will enable me to identify what's going on there. You'll find also that if you look at the knowledge, I've made sure that there's a knowledge question for every item of knowledge. So what we have here is a device which enables us to make sure that we are getting all of the unit requirements listed. You'll see 2.4 is there now. We'll make sure that all of the observations are being made that are necessary. And you'll notice that the KA, knowledge assessment column, is blanked out on that first page because none of the things on this first page is knowledge. It's all skills, elements, foundation skills, if there were any, and performance evidence are all skills, and therefore there's nothing in the knowledge assessment column at all. But if you look at the next page, you'll see that there's nothing in the performance assessment columns. They're all blacked out because what I'm measuring here is knowledge. And so these are going to be knowledge questions. You'll see that I've gone from forklift to forklift and mobile crane, and then in rigging to make sure that in actual fact I'm demonstrating my assessment skills across a range of different contexts. You'll see that I've gone to WorkSafe tasks rather than to employer CV and employer feedback in order to get this meaningful kinds of evidence. Now, what I'm illustrating here is that you can use the assessment plan and record to ultimately come down to the most efficient, clear-cut way of carrying out an assessment. And indeed, you'll notice that I've indicated up here, each element must be demonstrated on at least 2 different occasions. I could probably cut this back to 2 assessments. But the third assessment acts as a kind of reserve, a kind of backup. And you'll see that next time we meet because we're going to work with this diagram again, and I'll make sure you have copies of it because we're going to get into some of the detail then the next time we meet on the 12th of May, because we're going to be working with those 2 extra columns. Fundamentally, it says assessment plan and record. So not only can this serve as an assessment plan, but it can also now become a record of what you observe. So you can tick O1 and O2 and O3 and O4 if you see those performance criteria being seen. If you can tick O1, O2, O3, O4 twice in PA1, PA2 or PA3, then under outcome for the element, you can see there's a blank there, you can tick the element. If you can't do it twice, then you can't tick the element. And this way you end up with a set of ticks under outcome, and that set of ticks under outcome will ultimately lead to you being able to make a judgment in terms of overall performance of the competency. Now, we'll be leaving that till next time, but I just want to show to you that the assessment plan can serve an extra couple of functions. It can not only serve to record observations, it can also be used to record outcomes against the criteria, and then it can be used to make a record and a judgment. But it also, this document can serve to show that you followed due diligence in your judgment of competency, so that if there was any circumstance where litigation was to follow, here is proof that you measured all the things you were supposed to measure, saw all the things you were supposed to see, and made a judgment based on evidence. And in that sense, as an evidence trail, it gives you a kind of insurance and protection. Joanne has asked the question, oh, she just vanished, and I'm not too sure what it is now. I'll try and answer it when it comes back.
Joanne asked, so there should be no blank spots across all of the PA1, PA2, PA3.
Yeah, this is true. There could be blank spots because it only requires 2 different activities. But in order to make sure that we've got depth in the assessment, in this illustration, I've said there are no blank spots across. And that basically means that if I'm measuring element 1, I must be looking at all its performance criteria. If I'm looking at element 2, I must be looking at all its performance criteria and so on. So I don't expect to find blank spots. And if I read across the line, I should not find any blank spots at all against any of the performance criteria. When I've seen the performance criteria, I can tick the element. When I've seen the element twice, I can tick the outcome. But we'll see that next time we meet, because that's utilizing this as a decision-making tool, and that's our topic for next time. And there's a hand up here, Mel.
Joanne has asked, so minimum 2 for performance, then knowledge.
Yes, well, when it comes to performance, we need to, because we want to be able to see transfer and we want to be able to see retention. I've beautifully erased this from the board now, but do you remember I drew a little diagram which showed assessment 1 and assessment 2? And fundamentally, the argument is that with one assessment in one context, I have seen the performance of the competency. The second assessment tells me I've seen consistency, I have seen retention, and I have seen transfer, because the second assessment, PA1 and PA2 and PA3 are different. But in this particular model that I'm illustrating here, they could get PA1 or PA2 or PA3 wrong, so long as they get 2 right. And that is reflecting the fact that in this particular case, there are 3 different scenarios, PA1, PA2, PA3, using the same checklist, but the tasks are different each time. And if I see the person perform in 2 tasks out of 3, then I will argue that they've demonstrated transfer and at least a level of consistency. But it also gives me a bit of supplementary assessment. If they fall over on PA1, well, that we hope that they will learn from that and do better in PA2 and PA3. That just acknowledges the fact that people are learning entities. But we'll see this interpretation next time we meet, and I'll be sharing with you this document in its raw form like it is now, but also in its completed form with actual evidence written into it, and you'll be able to see then how it works. And we're looking at the slide which is called clustered assessment. And I have to say that we're very keen to see clustered assessment, because clustered assessment does enable us to make the assessment process more natural. I mean, very rarely do we actually use a competency on its own. Almost always a unit of competency will be one that is combined with other units to produce a productive outcome. And the clustering can illustrate that. And there are also other benefits. I mean, if there's a shared knowledge base, or even sometimes shared elements of competency, then clustering is a sensible way of reducing the assessment load. But we have to watch out for a number of things. The first is the cluster itself must not become so huge that it becomes impossible for a student to achieve it. I'm facing, and you can't see me doing this, but I'm facing a brick wall. And there's no way that I could leap from the bottom of the brick wall to the top of the brick wall. But if you push each brick out to form a series of steps, I can climb to the top of this wall. And the idea of competency was part of the idea of competency was to turn a big body of learning and skills into a series of manageable steps that you could move up. I don't know why I'm moving my arms around, you can't see me. A series of steps that you could climb. As soon as you start clustering units together, you are making the steps bigger. And so you must always ask yourself the question, if I cluster things for my convenience, am I making it more difficult for my students to acquire these competencies because they now come in big chunks instead of small steps? So clustering is good,
but try to make sure that the clustering does not become a problem for the students themselves. And then when you move on to assessment, you are going to get evidence, sorry, Mel, we're going to get evidence about the units all combined together. When it comes to making the judgment, we have to be able to pull the evidence apart, assign it to each element, I beg your pardon, each unit in the cluster, and then make separate judgments about each unit. So sometimes I see in an RTO they have an assessment summary for a cluster, and they have just one decision, satisfactory or not satisfactory, or competent or not competent, across all maybe 2 or 3 units in the cluster. And what you need, of course, to do is to say, for this unit, are they competent or not? For this unit, are they competent or not? And for this unit, are they competent or not? And those are not just one decision for the cluster, but separate decisions for each unit in the cluster. And when you look at the pattern of performance that the student has demonstrated through the assessment, you may well find that they've achieved 1, 2, or all 3 of the units in a cluster. That's a decision you need to make separately. We'll come back to that next time we meet, because that's part of the process of making the assessment decision. If we move on to the next slide, thanks Mel. The second thing we wanted to just touch on now is reasonable adjustment. And the key word in here is reasonable. There are reasonable adjustments and unreasonable adjustments. And when it comes to reasonable adjustments and unreasonable adjustments, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is acceptable in a way which retains the integrity of the unit of competency, the validity of the assessment of the unit of competency. I need to stress here that there are sort of small or a reasonable adjustments, where we make adjustments for a person who has literacy or numeracy or other issues of that kind. Maybe learning styles and habits might interfere, so we might make adjustments because of individual differences. But reasonable adjustment with a capital R and a capital A relates to the Commonwealth law, which is the Disability Discrimination Act. And in the Disability Discrimination Act, you are required to offer reasonable adjustment to a person who declares that they have a disability. And it has to be a defined disability. And if you look at the Act, you'll find that certain disabilities are defined within the Act as being relevant to this process. In those circumstances, you are going to need to make sure that that you consult with the student and decide whether or not the disability can be accommodated and still preserve the integrity of the unit of competency. If the unit of competency is going to be somehow or other invalidated by your adjustment, that would not be reasonable. Other things that would not be reasonable would be if the adjustment was horrifically expensive and the RTO couldn't afford it, or if the adjustment was going to harm the learning of other students, or if the adjustment was not one that could be replicated in a workplace. Keep in mind the workplace is ultimately our ultimate touchstone. So if you can't offer reasonable adjustment, then under the law, you must provide the student with a statement which says, you cannot do this unit or even this qualification, but certainly you respond to it on a unit by unit basis. And this is why we cannot reasonably accommodate your needs and your ambitions. On the other hand, if you can accommodate it, then you must provide under the law the student with a letter which says we will accommodate it and we will make available to you whatever adjustments are needed when the time comes for you to do that unit, so that you make a commitment to the student which says when we get to that unit, we will buy the necessary equipment or provide the necessary access or whatever resources are associated in terms of dealing with the disability. But keep in mind that it would be totally unreasonable to make an adjustment that would not reflect industry circumstances and or would damage the validity of the unit. Then if we go to the final one, which is RPL, which you recognise right at the beginning is part of Standard 1.8 or Clause 1.8, which talks about recognition of prior learning. we need to keep reminding ourselves that recognition of prior learning is not a soft assessment process. It basically enables a person to bypass the training or the learning and go straight to assessment. But the assessment you're going to do must comply with the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment, which means that you are going to have to observe them perform skills, and you're going to have to ask them questions about their knowledge. You haven't got any alternative. If you look at evidence from the past, then you have problems with knowing if it's authentic. You have problems with knowing if it's current, can they still do it? You have problems of knowing, is it valid? That is, does it really reflect the elements and all their performance criteria and so on? And you have problems of knowing whether it's sufficient. So you can use the evidence from the past to determine that they are ready to be assessed. Then you can do an assessment where you observe them and ask them questions. Now, if in that observation and questions you hear what you need to hear and see what you need to see, all of a sudden that portfolio of past evidence now becomes meaningful. It now becomes truth. And you can use that then to show consistency, transfer and retention. In other words, you can cut the assessments back, but what you can't do is simply say, oh, the hearsay evidence you presented to me, I will take on faith, and I will just assume that that's okay. You can't do that, because to do so would be to treat the RPL process as a very soft option compared to the process that we need to follow with our on-campus students. So there we are. We are going to come back to some of those issues on the 12th, I beg your pardon, of May, because on the 12th of May we're going to look a little bit more about the delivery and use of the assessment tools, and we're going to look at them using the tools to make decisions, and we're going to look at validation. And so we're going to find ourselves revisiting many of these ideas, but from the perspective of the use of the tools, the decision making with the tools, and validation. If you have particular questions, that you use this email address, through which we can learn of your questions, and then we can provide you with feedback. I think we'll finish off our session. Thank you very, very much for being with us. We had a really good number of people, and thank you for those who have had the chance to ask questions and put ideas to us. I thank that very much. Please feel free to put questions to us if you wish, and we hope that we'll see you, if that's the right word to use, on the 12th of May for the third session. Thank you very much, folks.